Kwanza River runs black beneath a moonless sky. Water slaps against hollowed-out tree trunks. Makeshift canoes carrying what remains of a kingdom. Somewhere in the darkness, Portuguese muskets crack like thunder, their echoes swallowed by the vast African night. The year is 1629, and the most wanted woman in West Central Africa is vanishing into the shadows. Her name is Nzinga, Queen of Ndongo, daughter of kings, and now a fugitive. Behind her lies the burning capital she can no longer defend. Ahead stretches only darkness and the promise of exile. Portuguese soldiers sweep the riverbanks with torches. Their commander's certain that this time, finally, they have broken the spine of the African resistance. They are wrong. Because here, in this moment of absolute defeat, as water laps against the side of her escape vessel, and loyal followers whisper prayers into the humid air, something extraordinary is beginning. This is not the end of Queen Nzinga's story. This flight to exile would not be her end. It would be the beginning of her greatest chapter, a transformation so complete, so audacious that it would rewrite the rules of colonial warfare and echo through centuries. How did this African queen turn catastrophic defeat at the hands of a colonial superpower into strategic victory? How did she transform from hunted fugitive to conquering founder? And how did one woman's refusal to submit create a legend that neither Portuguese steel nor the passage of 4 centuries could destroy? You're listening to The Crow's Tales, and this is The Great Escape of Queen Nzinga. To understand the magnitude of what Queen Nzinga achieved, we must first understand the world that sought to destroy her. The early 17th century marked a brutal new chapter in African-European relations. The Portuguese caravels had been prowling the West African coast for over a century, but by the 1620s, their presence had evolved from coastal trading posts into something far more sinister. A systematic engine of human exploitation that would reshape continents. From their stronghold in Luanda, established in 1575, Portuguese colonial administrators orchestrated what would become one of history's most devastating forced migrations. The Atlantic slave trade was entering its most voracious phase. Sugar plantations in Brazil demanded bodies, hundreds of thousands of them. And West Central Africa, with its proximity to Portuguese-controlled ports, had become the bleeding heart of that monstrous enterprise. But this was not simply a story of European dominance. Portuguese power in the region was built on a precarious foundation of military technology, strategic alliances with local rulers, and the cynical exploitation of existing African conflicts. They positioned themselves as kingmakers, backing compliant rulers while systematically undermining those who resisted. They wrapped their conquest in the language of Christian salvation while practicing a brutality that would have horrified Christ himself. Into this maelstrom stepped the kingdom of Ndongo, proud, ancient, and increasingly desperate. Located in what is now northern Angola, Ndongo had maintained its independence through skilled diplomacy and military prowess for generations. Its people, the Mbundu, had developed sophisticated ironworking techniques, maintained extensive trade networks reaching deep into the African interior, and created political structures that balanced centralized authority with local autonomy. But by the 1620s, Ndongo found itself trapped in an ever-tightening vice. Portuguese military expeditions, equipped with firearms and supported by African allies seeking their own advantages, pushed deeper into Mbundu territory each year. Traditional defensive strategies, the same ones that had protected the kingdom for centuries, crumbled before gunpowder and steel. Villages that had stood for generations vanished overnight. Their populations marched in chain toward the coast. This was the inheritance that fell to Nzinga when she assumed power in 1624. A kingdom hemorrhaging people, territory, and hope. Yet where others saw inevitable defeat, she saw opportunity for transformation. Her response would challenge every assumption about how an African ruler could resist European colonialism. The year 1629 began with the sound of Portuguese boots marching through the sacred grounds of Ndongo. For 5 years, Queen Nzinga had waged a war of resistance that had frustrated, infuriated, and occasionally terrified the Portuguese colonial administration. She had inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse and transformed it into a symbol of defiance. Through brilliant diplomacy, she had played Portuguese factions against each other. Through guerrilla tactics, she had made every Portuguese advance costly. Through sheer force of personality, she had held together a coalition of nobles, warriors, and common people who might otherwise have submitted to colonial rule. But even the strongest will cannot forever hold back the tide. The Portuguese had finally found their weapon. Not in superior firepower, though they had that, but in an age-old tool of empire, the puppet ruler. They had identified Ndongo Haria Kilawanji, a man with just enough royal blood to claim legitimacy and just enough weakness to be controlled. With Portuguese backing, he declared himself the rightful king of Ndongo, denouncing Nzinga as a usurper, a woman who had violated sacred traditions to steal power. The accusation stung because it had contained a grain of truth. Nzinga's rise to power had indeed broken precedent. The Mbundu traditionally passed kingship through male lines, but desperate times had called for extraordinary measures, and many had supported her claim, recognizing that traditional leadership had failed to meet the colonial threat. Now, that support fractured. Some nobles, exhausted by years of warfare and tempted by Portuguese promises of peace and trade, defected to Ndongo Haria. Others, terrified by Portuguese reprisals, simply melted away into the forests. The elaborate network of alliances Nzinga had cultivated, military, political, spiritual, began to unravel like a tapestry pulled from too many corners at once. By the spring of 1629, Portuguese forces, reinforced with African auxiliaries loyal to the puppet king, had penetrated deep into Ndongo's heartland. They moved with the confidence of conquerors, burning villages that had shown loyalty to Nzinga, enslaving populations wholesale, and installing new chiefs who would answer to Luanda, rather than to any African sovereign. Nzinga fought with the fury of a cornered lioness. She led from the front, they say, her presence on the battlefield worth 100 warriors. She organised lightning raids on Portuguese supply lines, turning their advance into a costly crawl. She spread word that any Mbundu who collaborated with the invaders would be cursed by the ancestors, their lineages forever shamed. But courage alone cannot stop bullets. Fury alone cannot rebuild burned villages or resurrect the dead. The decisive blow came in the dry season. Portuguese forces, guided by African scouts who knew every hidden path, every secret water source, launched a coordinated assault on Nzinga's remaining strongholds. Her army, outnumbered and outgunned, began to fragment. Some units fought to the death. Others, seeing the writing on the wall, negotiated their own surrenders. And then came the moment that would have broken a lesser leader. Word had reached Nzinga that the Portuguese had taken her sister, Kambu, also known as Barbara, one of the few family members who had survived the violent politics of her succession. The Portuguese would use her as leverage, threatening her life unless Nzinga surrendered. Standing in what remained of her war council, surrounded by exhausted generals and frightened advisors, Nzinga faced the hardest decision of her reign. Surrender meant certain death, or worse, she would be paraded as a trophy through Luanda's streets before execution. It meant the end of organised Mbundu resistance, the transformation of Ndongo into nothing more than a feeding ground for slave raiders. But there was another option, one that required abandoning everything she had fought to preserve. The decision, when it came, was swift and absolute. Destroy what cannot be carried, execute anyone whose loyalty wavers, divide the retreat into multiple columns to confuse pursuit. Move like the seasonal floods of the Kwanzaa, appearing to recede only to return with greater force. This was not defeat, this was transformation. The evacuation began under the cover of darkness. Not a retreat, Nzinga would never call it that, but a strategic repositioning. She gathered those still loyal, warriors who had sworn blood oaths, nobles who refused to bow to puppet kings, common people who had lost everything to Portuguese raids and now had nothing left to lose but hope itself. They moved like ghosts through their own homeland, using paths known only to hunters and healers. Portuguese patrols passed within shouting distance, but the bush kept its secrets. Every mile took them further from the kingdom's traditional boundaries, from the sacred sites where generations of Mbundus had been crowned and the graves of ancestors who had ruled when Ndongo's power was unquestioned. The Kwanza River became their road to exile. Its waters, which had for centuries marked Ndongo's frontiers, now offered escape. They commandeered fishing boats, built rafts from fallen trees, and fashioned crude vessels from whatever building materials they could gather. It was a flotilla of the desperate and the determined, carrying not just people, but the living embodiment of Ndongo's sovereignty. The Portuguese, discovering Nzinga's escape, flew into a rage that revealed their fear. They had not merely wanted to defeat her, they had needed to capture her, to display her submission as proof that African resistance was futile. Her escape transformed their military victory into political uncertainty. As long as Nzinga lived, as long as she remained free, their conquest of Ndongo would remain incomplete. Search parties scoured the riverbanks. Portuguese commanders offered rewards that would make a commoner rich for life. They threatened collective punishment for any village suspecting of aiding the fugitive queen. But the Kwanza is a long river, and the African wilderness has many hiding places for those who know its ways. Nzinga's destination was the Ndongo Islands, a cluster of river islands that offered a natural fortification and had long served as a refuge for those fleeing various conflicts. Here, surrounded by water and hidden by dense vegetation, she would make her first stand as a queen in exile. But the Ndongo Islands were no paradise. They were malarial, resource poor, and could barely support the hundreds of refugees that had followed Nzinga into exile. Portuguese forces quickly identified her location and established a loose siege, not attacking directly, but ensuring that any attempt to leave the islands would be met with force. For months, Nzinga held court in a makeshift shelter that was a mockery of the royal palaces she had known. Her kingdom had shrunk to a few muddy islands. Her army was reduced to a few hundred exhausted warriors, and her treasury consisted of whatever jewellery and trade goods they had managed to carry in their flight. Lesser leaders would have negotiated surrender. Lesser leaders would have accepted Portuguese offers of comfortable exile in exchange for public submission. But Nzinga looked at her reduced circumstances and saw not defeat, but opportunity. If she could not rule the kingdom she had inherited, she would create a new one. If traditional warfare had failed, she would invent new strategies. If the Portuguese thought they had won, she would teach them that the war had barely begun. From the Ndongo Islands, messages began to spread through the underground networks that connected Mbundu communities. The Queen lives, the Queen resists, and the Queen will return. The Portuguese monitoring these communications dismissed them as the desperate propaganda of a doomed cause. They had seen fugitive rulers before, proud figures who fled into exile promising return, only to fade into historical footnotes. Nzinga, they believed, would follow the same trajectory. They could not have been more wrong. The seasons changed, and with them, Queen Nzinga's strategy evolved from mere survival to something more ambitious. By late 1629, the Ndongo Islands had become a death trap. Portuguese forces had perfected their siege, turning what had been a refuge into an open-air prison. Food supplies dwindled, disease spread through the overcrowded camps. Most devastating of all, the psychological weight of confinement began to crack the resolve of her followers. Warriors who had faced Portuguese guns without flinching now faced a more insidious enemy: despair. Nzinga knew that static defence meant slow death. The Portuguese could afford to wait, she could not. The escape from Ndongo came with the rains. As the wet season transformed paths into muddy torrents and made Portuguese patrols miserable and ineffective, Nzinga struck. She divided her forces, some creating noisy diversions at expected crossing points, while others slipped silently through gaps in the siege lines. By the time the Portuguese commanders realised what had happened, she had vanished into the vast interior, leaving them to curse the rain and their own overconfidence. But escape to where? This is where Nzinga made a decision that would horrify traditionalists. She would ally with the Imbangala. The Imbangala were the terror of Central Africa, warrior bands who had rejected traditional kinship structures, who practiced rituals that other African societies considered abominations, who lived by raiding and recognised no authority but strength. They were mercenaries, available to the highest bidder, as likely to work for the Portuguese as against them. Most African rulers viewed them as a plague to be avoided or destroyed. Nzinga saw them as an opportunity. The alliance began with her marriage to Asanji, one of the most powerful Imbangala warlords. It was a union that shocked everyone. Here was a queen who had positioned herself as defender of the Ubuntu tradition, joining with forces who were the antithesis of tradition. The marriage ceremony itself became legendary, not for its romance, but for its calculated political theatre. Nzinga arrived not as a supplicant, but as an equal, bringing gifts that demonstrated wealth she no longer possessed, projecting power from a position of weakness. The strategic logic was brilliant. The Imbangala had something she desperately needed: military expertise adapted to the new realities of 17th century warfare. They were masters of mobility, able to strike and vanish before retaliation could be organised. They had no fixed villages for the Portuguese to burn, no agricultural cycles that tied them to specific locations. They were, in essence, a military system perfectly suited to asymmetric warfare. Under Imbangala's tutelage, Nzinga's forces learned to become ghosts. Traditional Ubuntu warfare had emphasised set-piece battles, displays of courage, and the protection of territory. The Imbangala taught different lessons: how to live off the land without established supply lines, how to turn the bush itself into a weapon, and how to make the enemy fear the night more than death itself. But the alliance came at a terrible cost. To maintain credibility with her Imbangala allies, Nzinga had to adopt some of their customs. She participated in rituals that violated everything the Ubuntu held sacred. She allowed practices in her camp that would have horrified the ancestors. Some of her original followers, unable to reconcile this new reality with the queen they had chosen to follow, simply slipped away into the night. They could follow a queen in exile, but not one who seemed to have exiled herself from her own soul. Yet for everyone who left, others arrived. The displaced, the desperate, the enslaved who had escaped Portuguese captivity. They came to Nzinga's mobile court because she offered something no one else could: active resistance. While other African leaders negotiated degrees of submission, Nzinga fought. While others accepted the new reality of Portuguese domination, she insisted that reality could be changed. The guerrilla war that followed throughout 1630 was unlike anything the Portuguese had previously encountered in Africa. Nzinga's forces would materialise from nowhere, strike at slave caravans, and dissolve before retaliation could be organised. They poisoned water sources. They spread disinformation that turned Portuguese allies against each other. They made the cost of every Portuguese advance so high that even victories felt like defeats. Portuguese soldiers began to break. They saw Nzinga in every shadow, heard her war drum in every thunderstorm. Commanders reported that their men refused night patrols, that African auxiliaries were deserting in droves, that the very landscape seemed to have turned against them. But Nzinga knew that guerrilla warfare alone could not achieve her ultimate goal. She could harass the Portuguese indefinitely, but harassment was not victory. She needed a base and a territory from which she could rebuild not just military power, but political legitimacy. She needed a kingdom. By early 1631, her eyes had turned decisively to Matamba. The kingdom of Matamba lay to the east of Ndongo, beyond the immediate reach of Portuguese power, but still close enough to threaten their interests. It was an ancient realm with its own proud traditions, its own complex politics, and crucially, a history of female rulers that made Nzinga's gender less of a liability than it had been in Ndongo. But Matamba was no vacant throne waiting for a claimant. It had its own queen, Mwongo Matamba, who had ruled for years and had her own alliances her own armies, and her own legitimacy. For Nzinga to take Matamba, it would require not just military conquest, but political genius. Throughout 1630 and early 1631, while maintaining her guerrilla war against the Portuguese, Nzinga was quietly laying the groundwork for something far more ambitious. Her scouts, disguised as traders, refugees, and religious pilgrims, had been mapping Matamba's political landscape. They brought back intelligence, not just about fortifications and troop movements, but about something far more valuable: discontent. The picture that emerged was fascinating. Mwongo Matamba was competent but uninspiring. She had maintained peace through neutrality, but peace in a time of regional chaos was increasingly seen as weakness. Portuguese slave raids hadn't yet reached Matamba's heartland, but they were coming closer each year. The kingdom's war chiefs wondered when, not if, they would be next. More importantly, they wondered if their queen would, or could, resist when that day came. Nzinga positioned herself as the answer to their unspoken fears. Through careful diplomacy conducted in secret throughout 1631, she didn't present herself as a conqueror, but as a protector. Her message was simple and powerful. The Portuguese were coming for everyone, eventually. Matamba could wait to be conquered alone, or it could join her and become the heart of the African resistance. The choice was theirs. The actual conquest of Matamba was a masterpiece of political theatre stretched across 4 years. It began not with invasion, but with infiltration. Nzinga's supporters appeared in Matamba's markets, spreading stories of her victories against the Portuguese. They whispered in the courts of provincial nobles about the wealth and honour that flowed to those who joined her cause. They reminded Matamba's people that their kingdom had a tradition of strong queens, and here was the strongest queen of all, seeking not to destroy, but to lead. When military action finally came in 1631, it was almost anticlimactic. Several of Matamba's key generals had already secretly pledged allegiance to Nzinga. Provincial nobles who controlled strategic territories declared neutrality rather than resist. The trading cities, seeing which way the wind was blowing, opened their gates without a fight. The confrontation between the two queens, when it finally occurred, was less a battle than a transfer of power, orchestrated by forces beyond Mwongo Matamba's control. Her army, seeing their generals defect and their allies evaporate, simply melted away. Mwongo Matamba herself was captured, but here Nzinga showed political sophistication that surprised even her enemies. Instead of executing the defeated queen, as Imbangala custom demanded, she had her branded as a war captive, but spared her life. Even more remarkably, she took Mwongo Matamba's daughter into her service as one of her warriors. The message was clear: Nzinga was not another Imbangala warlord, she was a queen building a kingdom. But conquest was only the beginning. From 1631 to 1635, Nzinga faced the far harder task of transforming military victory into political legitimacy. She had to convince Matamba's nobles that she was not a foreign conqueror, but their rightful queen. She had to integrate thousands of Ndongo refugees without alienating Matamba's original inhabitants. She had to create a new political synthesis that honoured both kingdoms' traditions while transcending their limitations. She moved carefully. She retained Matamba's administrative structure, confirming nobles who pledged loyalty in their positions. She participated in Matamba's traditional ceremonies, showing respect for local customs even as she introduced new elements drawn from Ndongo traditions. She established her capital gradually, testing loyalty and building trust before committing to permanent positions. Most importantly, she never abandoned her claim to Ndongo. She styled herself Queen of Ndongo and Matamba. The Ndongo refugees who had followed her were not homeless wanderers, but citizens of a double kingdom that would one day reclaim all of its territories. The Portuguese watched with growing alarm. Matamba was further from their coastal bases, harder to attack. It controlled interior trade routes they couldn't reach. Worse, it was becoming living proof that Portuguese expansion could be reversed. Portuguese attempts to destabilise Nzinga's new kingdom began immediately, but proved consistently ineffective. They tried to stir up rebellion among Matamba nobles, offering recognition and trade privileges to anyone that would overthrow the usurper queen. They attempted to support Mwanga Matamba's restoration, though she apparently lacked sufficient support to mount a serious challenge. They sent assassins who disappeared without completing their missions. They spread propaganda that no one believed. Nothing worked. Nzinga had learned from Ndongo. She created an intelligence network that identified threats before they materialized. She bound Matamba's nobles to her through calculated rewards and consequences. She made herself indispensable by providing successful resistance against Portuguese encroachment. By 1635, after 4 years of patient consolidation, Matamba had become the center of African resistance, and the Portuguese would have to reckon with Nzinga for the next 3 decades. The Matamba that Nzinga inherited was a kingdom of potential. The Matamba that she would build over the following years would become a beacon of African resistance and independence. Her first priority was a demographic revolution. Matamba became a sanctuary for those fleeing Portuguese slave raids. Word spread throughout the secret networks. In Queen Nzinga's lands, the enslaved could become free. The powerless could find protection, and those who had lost everything could begin again. They came by the hundreds, then thousands, not just Mbundu from Ndongo, but people from dozens of ethnic groups affected by the expanding slave trade. This influx could have created chaos. Different languages, customs, and loyalties might have torn the kingdom apart, but Nzinga turned diversity into strength. She established a policy of cultural synthesis where different traditions were not suppressed but incorporated into a new Matamba identity. Former slaves became soldiers. Refugees from destroyed villages were given land. Skilled craftspeople were organized into guilds that preserved and transmitted their knowledge. The economy Nzinga built was revolutionary in its structure. While the Portuguese economy in Angola depended on the export of human beings, Nzinga created an economy based on controlling trade routes rather than raiding for slaves. Matamba sat astride the major paths connecting the Atlantic coast to the Central African interior. Ivory, copper, and other goods had to pass through her territory. Nzinga taxed this trade, using the revenue to build her military and support her growing population. The military reforms she instituted transformed Matamba's forces into the most effective anti-colonial army in Central Africa. She combined traditional African tactics with innovations learned from the Imbangala and observations of Portuguese methods. Her armies included units of female warriors, not the Amazons of European imagination, but disciplined soldiers who served as both fighters and symbols of her authority. She established arsenals where captured Portuguese weapons were maintained and reproduced by African smiths who learned to work with new materials and techniques. By 1640, Nzinga commanded a formidable kingdom, but she knew that Matamba alone could never defeat the Portuguese Empire. She needed allies, and history was about to provide them. In 1641, everything changed. Dutch warships appeared off the coast of Luanda, their cannons announcing the arrival of a new player in the struggle for Central Africa. The Dutch West India Company, locked in global conflict with the Portuguese, had come to claim Portugal's most profitable slave port. Within weeks, Luanda fell to Dutch forces, and the Portuguese found themselves suddenly on the defensive. Nzinga's response was immediate and decisive. She sent ambassadors to the Dutch before the smoke had cleared from Luanda's fortifications. Her message was simple: we share an enemy, let us share a victory. The Dutch, recognizing the strategic value of an alliance with the most powerful African ruler in the interior, eagerly accepted. With Dutch firearms flowing into Matamba and Portuguese forces divided between coastal defense and interior control, Nzinga saw an opportunity she had waited decades for: the chance to reclaim Ndongo. She moved her capital to Kavanga, positioning herself closer to her ancestral lands. From 1641 to 1644, her army systematically recaptured territory that had been lost 15 years earlier. Portuguese garrisons, cut off from reinforcement, fell one by one. The Portuguese, desperate to stop her advance, finally assembled what they believed would be a decisive force. Governor Pedro Cesar de Menezes, humiliated by Nzinga's success and pressured by Lisbon to restore Portuguese prestige, gathered over 3,000 soldiers for a final confrontation. They would meet Nzinga's forces at Ngoloma, a savannah crossroad that controlled access to both Matamba and the reclaimed portions of Ndongo. The morning of the battle began with Portuguese drums echoing across the savannah. The governor had assembled his force with meticulous care. Portuguese musketeers, African auxiliaries who still believed in Portuguese invincibility, and artillery pieces dragged at enormous cost through the bush. They advanced in European formation, a moving fortress of firepower designed to sweep away any African resistance. Nzinga watched them come from the tree line. At 61 years old, she still insisted on commanding from the front, her presence worth more than any tactical advantage. Around her waited 8,000 warriors, a coalition that represented everything she had built. Mbundu veterans who had followed her since the form of Ndongo stood alongside Imbangala fighters who had taught her the art of bush warfare. Matamba soldiers defending their homeland fought beside escaped slaves who had found freedom in her kingdom. Dutch military advisors had provided tactical insights, but this would be an African victory. She had deliberately chosen this battlefield. The tall elephant grass limited visibility. The seasonal wetlands made the Portuguese artillery nearly useless, and the wind, she had waited 3 days for the wind to be just right. The Portuguese advanced in their traditional squares, drums beating cadence. Officers shouting orders in a language that seemed absurd in this landscape. They expected Nzinga's forces to charge headlong into their guns. They were not prepared for what actually happened. The attack began with fire. Nzinga's warriors had spent the previous night positioning themselves in the tall grass, and now, at her signal, they set it ablaze. The wind, carefully calculated, drove walls of flames towards the Portuguese lines. Smoke billowed across the battlefield, turning the morning into artificial twilight. Portuguese soldiers, trained for European battlefields, found themselves blind and choking, their careful formations dissolving into chaos. Then came the war cries, not from one direction, but from all sides. Nzinga had divided her forces into multiple wings, each attacking in sequence, never giving the Portuguese time to reform their lines. Her female warriors led the central assault, their presence so unexpected that Portuguese soldiers reportedly froze in confusion, unable to process the sight of women cutting through their ranks with the same ferocity as any male warrior. The battle became a melee in the smoke. Portuguese muskets, so devastating in open field battles, became nearly useless in close quarters. African spears and swords, wielded by warriors who knew this land intimately, found their mark again and again. Portuguese soldiers stumbled through unfamiliar terrain, while Nzinga's forces moved like shadows through smoke they had created. Governor Menezes himself barely escaped, carried from the field by his personal guard as his army disintegrated around him. Portuguese casualties were devastating. Over half their force killed or wounded. Their artillery abandoned in the mud, their African auxiliaries either dead or fled. Nzinga's forces pursued the survivors for miles, drums announcing their victory to every village within hearing. Standing among the captured Portuguese weapons as the smoke cleared, Nzinga understood both the magnitude and the limits of her victory. She had proven that the Portuguese could be decisively defeated and that African arms could triumph over European technology when properly led. The Dutch would report this victory to Amsterdam, where it would be celebrated as evidence that their alliance strategy was working. The Portuguese would report it to Lisbon, where it would cause panic about the future of their African empire. But Nzinga, even in triumph, remained realistic. The Portuguese still held the coast. They would adapt their tactics, seek new allies, and wait for the global situation to change. She had perhaps 15 years left to live, 15 years to consolidate what she had built, to ensure Matamba would survive her. Ngoloma had given her momentum, but momentum was not permanence. The war would continue. The Portuguese response revealed their growing desperation. They launched multiple invasions of Matamba, only to find their armies decimated by disease, ambush, and the logistical nightmares of fighting far from their coastal bases. They tried economic warfare, attempting to redirect trade routes away from Matamba, only to find that Nzinga's control of interior connections was too strong to break. They even resorted to assassination attempts, all of which failed, often spectacularly. Governor Fineo de Souza, writing to Lisbon in frustration, complained that Nzinga had become more powerful in exile than she ever was as Queen of Ndongo. He requested reinforcements, more funds, and permission to negotiate a peace that would have essentially recognised Matamba's independence. Lisbon, unwilling to admit defeat to an African queen, refused all three requests. Portuguese military strategy had to be completely reconsidered. Expeditions that had once been organised with confidence now required twice the men, 3 times the supplies, and still often ended in failure. More significantly, Nzinga's success inspired others. Rulers who had been considering accommodation with the Portuguese found new courage. Resistance movements that have been suppressed flickered back into life. The enslaved, hearing stories of a kingdom where they could be free, attempted escapes with greater frequency. The Portuguese found themselves not consolidating an empire, but desperately trying to prevent its unravelling. But the true measure of Nzinga's achievement would only become clear with time. She would rule Matamba for over 3 decades more, until her death in 1663, at the age of 81. During those years, she would continue to evolve, adapt, and resist. She would convert to Christianity, sincerely or strategically, historians still debate, using faith as both shield and sword against Portuguese aggression. She would train her sister Cambu, eventually ransomed from Portuguese captivity, as her successor, ensuring that female leadership of Matamba would continue. She would see the Portuguese forced to negotiate with her as an equal, signing treaties that recognised Matamba's sovereignty. The kingdom she built would outlast her by centuries. While other African states fell one by one to European colonialism, Matamba maintained its independence into the late 19th century. The military tactics she developed would be studied and adapted by resistance movements across Africa. The precedent she set, that a woman could not just rule but lead resistance against colonial power, would inspire generations of African women to claim their place in political life. Today, in the Republic of Angola, Nzinga is more than a historical figure. She is a national symbol. Her image appears on currency. Streets, schools, and institutions bear her name. In the national narrative of resistance against colonialism, she stands not as a footnote but as a foundational figure. The statue erected in her honour in Luanda shows her not as she was in her final years, an elderly queen who had learned to navigate the complexities of a changing world, but as she was in 1629, defiant, weapon in hand, ready for war. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of her legacy lies not in monuments or memories, but in that pivot from flight to fight, from refugee to ruler. In those crucial years between 1629 and 1631, Nzinga demonstrated that defeat need not be final, that exile could become opportunity, that a single individual's refusal to surrender could alter the trajectory of history. The waters of the Kwanza River still flow today, carrying their secrets into the Atlantic. Somewhere along its banks, perhaps, remain traces of that desperate flight in 1629. A broken oar, a piece of pottery, some physical remnant of the night when Queen chose exile over surrender. Well then, there you have it. If you've watched this far and like what you've heard, then consider liking and subscribing. Also, you can hit the notification bell if you want to be notified of future stories. I release a new one every Sunday. As a new channel, this really helps not only push these stories in front of more of you lovely people, but helps reassure me I'm not just sending these off into the ether, never to be seen again. If you've listened this far and don't like what you've heard, then, what on earth are you doing? Right then, off you pop. Thanks for listening.